All right, we're all.
Oh,
The pressure's on.
no pressure. So do I have to click continue then?
Probably.
Uh,
I'll let you know when the page switches.
all right. Well, thank you, Jack, for the kind introduction. I'm excited to share some things that I've learned with you guys today. First, I would like to say, if you're not a BHA member, I'd highly recommend if you hunt public land like I really enjoy the challenge of hunting deer on public land. I'm sure that many of you guys are the same way if you're here attending and listening to this tonight. So if you're not, BHA is a great organization. They're working hard to help preserve areas of public land. Um, right now, there's lots of different things going on, but they're constantly working. And I think that if you're one of those who loves public land, you really should be a member. Um, that being said, I'll get into what everybody's here to talk about or hear about tonight. Hopefully, a lot of what I'm sharing are just things that I've observed, things that I've learned, and they're not necessarily factual. Take it with a grain of salt. It's one person's opinion. But I have put forth a lot of effort trying to learn about these deer. I really enjoy blacktail deer hunting. It's my favorite hunting that I do. I'm an avid elk hunter. I basically archery hunt. I'll give you guys a little just history on like what my experience or where I've hunted. I'm born and raised mostly here. Well, I wasn't born in Oregon, but I've been raised in Oregon and hunted my whole life in Oregon. And I've hunted everywhere from Southern Oregon down in Roseburg, Medford, all that area. I haven't really hunted the South Coast, but I live currently in Astoria and I've hunted the North Coast here the last 7 years. And then I've also hunted in Washington across the river for blacktail. I've hunted in the Willamette Valley pretty extensively for blacktail. When I went to college, I went to Western Oregon. So I hunted down by Corvallis and some out by Eugene. So I've hunted in a lot of different units. And I've done a lot of different hunts. I've hunted the Cascade blacktails. I've hunted Southern Oregon Cascade blacktails. I've hunted the coastal blacktails. So I feel like I've got a pretty good taste of how they differ, and they definitely do. There's a lot of differences between them, and many of you guys are probably aware of those. But I guess that's kind of just a quick background of what I've done. I'm definitely I don't feel qualified to give this presentation, but Jack asked me to do it, and I love talking about blacktail deer hunting and hearing what other people think and what they've observed, and so that's why you guys are here today. So I'm just going to share what I've got here. I put together this presentation today. I kind of threw it together last minute because I can get a little off topic at times. So this is to hopefully keep me on task. So let me see here. Can you guys see that first page there? It should say Blacktail Biology.
Yep, that popped up.
Okay, so this page just has some findings from a blacktail study. Recently, I was lucky enough to be on a podcast with the head biologist, blacktail biologist for the state of Oregon. And we asked him a lot of questions, and we're able to talk to him about they've been doing a pretty extensive radio collar study throughout the state. And didn't get to ask all the questions I wanted, but we were able to get some good takeaway points that I wanted to share with everybody here. One of the main things that I took away from our questions with him was that they found in regards to blacktail bucks, that their peak activity was from 2 to 4 in the morning. And then another key thing that I took away from it was that there was a spike of activity in the middle of the day for bucks that was really consistent too. And that was in that, he said noon to 1, but being on my observations, I would extend it more from maybe like 10 to 2, depending on lots of different factors. We also saw, spikes just before sunup and right after sunset. So those things all make sense. We're going to talk tonight about we can only hunt during the day. And so a lot of what my focus is on has been on hunting blacktails is, what are they doing during the day, and what's going to give you the best chance to get a chance at these guys during the day, because we can't hunt them during that time when they're up on their feet and moving from 2 to 4 a.m. Some of the main thing to note on these findings is this was not during the rut. This was the bucks throughout the rest of the year. They couldn't have collars on the bucks during the rut because their neck swells up and they could potentially kill them. So they had collars that would fall off in the month of October. So they had information all the way up to right before the rut, and that was what these findings were based off of. My assumption, this is kind of my own interpretation of it, but is that their activity at this 2 to 4 time frame, I really think is most likely associated with their heavy feeding patterns. And when they're, and then like right before sunup and right after sundown, they're moving to and from these prime feeding areas from their bedding area. And so I think that spike from 10 to 2, if you've ever been out glassing mule deer in open country, you watch them bed down, they'll sit there and watch them for hours. They'll get up randomly in the middle of the day, stretch, go munch on some food for a little bit, and they go lay down, sometimes in the same bed, sometimes another bed that's close by. And obviously, these are just assumptions and theories. You can't like make hard, fast rules. They're wild animals and they do random things at random times. But we're all trying about trying to find patterns so that we can give ourselves better odds here. One thing that they found is that coast range and valley bucks have a much smaller home range. And so home range is like that total area that a deer will like kind of move throughout the year or through its lifetime. And it's probably more throughout a year because, sometimes things happen. A deer will get up and move an area from a long ways away. Even a blacktail could and relocate his home range. If his area gets logged and everything changes, he's going to completely move to a completely different area and establish a new home range. But once they have an area that they like, they really are these coast bucks, and I found this to be 100% true, is they have such a small home range. And especially the mature bucks, if they've survived a season or two, they become savvy to the part of not coming out and traveling a long ways. The more that these deer move, the less likely the more likely they are to get killed. So they have everything they need on the coast of Oregon. There's lots of food, lots of brush, lots of water. They don't have to go far for all of that stuff. So they really don't have to cover as much ground where, like I just came from Wyoming elk hunting in September. We were following these elk. In the morning, we'd be on where they're feeding, and we would follow them bugling back to their beds. And some places they went 3 or 4 miles. And so a much wider range of habitat there, and things are more spread out. And so those animals move more, where these ones don't have to. And I think that's one of the things that makes blacktail so hard is it seems like they're not there. Where are they? And they're really just right there under your nose, not moving very much. Cascade bucks, their home range is bigger. He said they've done a lot of radio color studies. They have some really cool ones going down on in like the Southern Oregon and some of the middle Cascade areas where they've seen some of these bucks when they migrate. Obviously, their home range will be much bigger. But during the course of the year, if they have an area that they like to hang out in, it's usually within about a square mile. So keep that in mind. Those were things that they found here in Oregon on real bucks that lived in the wild. So the buck to doe ratio, they have established to be 40 to 50 bucks to 100 does. And I'm sure most of you guys are going like, yeah, right. There's no way that's true. I've seen like 35 does and I haven't seen a buck, and I'm not sure how much I am in complete agreement with their assumption that it is based off of fecal sampling, which they started doing a few years ago. And if you guys aren't aware of that, the way that ODFW used to establish their herd estimates was mainly by spotlighting at night. And then they would also, they also did some other stuff. I'm trying to remember, but basically it wasn't real good. They couldn't get really good population estimates and buck to doe ratios because these deer are so hard to see. But they mainly did it by spotlighting. Well, now they do this. They've contracted out. They hire these people with these dogs that can detect deer droppings basically. And when they plot an area, they'll pick like a square mile. They plot an area and they go through that whole area and they chart every place they find fresh deer droppings, and they take a sample of it, and then they go back and test it. And they can tell if that deer is male or female. They can't tell how old it is, but they can tell if it's the same individual. So if they see the same poop and the same deer in the same area, it just counts as one individual. And that's how they've established population and buck to doe ratios. And they found that there's a lot more bucks on the landscape than what they have previously thought. My own theory on that, not to get off topic here, is that they are, I really think that there's a lot of young bucks, you know, because it could be a fawn buck, it could be a spike buck, but, you know, we see pretty good fawn recruitment initially with the deer here. And so I don't know if that's the case or not, but either way, there's more bucks there than what we see and what we really think. And those were some of the findings they took from that. Another thing I didn't put in here that I wanted to add that I found really interesting, and I think you guys will like this, was they found out how many deer per square mile based off of different habitat types. And they broke it up by 3 different habitat types. One of them was national forest or federal lands, which you guys know is not logged hardly at all. It's mostly old growth timber. It's really sterile. There's not a lot of good feed in there. And they found that there was about 4 deer per square mile in that landscape. Then they had large private timber company lands, which is most of what we're used to hunting, right? The Weyerhaeuser, Hancock, you know, there's tons of different Roseburg Resource. There's tons of timber companies out there, but they all have kind of different logging practices, but they just lumped them together. And they found that in those areas, there was about 11 deer per square mile in those areas. And then the third group was small private parcels, less than 350 acres. In those areas, I believe, if I remember right, had like 14 or 15 deer per square mile. And all that really made sense to me. Just to kind of elaborate on that, you know, the amount of deer that can live in an area really is relying on how much food is there to support them as a herd. And in those national forest areas, there's not as much viable feed for the black-tailed deer. And so therefore deer are more spread out. They browse and travel more. I would be willing to bet that their home range is a little bigger because they have to move more to get enough food in their belly to sustain them. Where deer on the timber company land, where there's clear cuts and there's ample forage and food available, that's going to allow more deer to live there and support more deer and elk and other animals too. And then the private parcels, the small ones, you know, that could be areas close to town, cemeteries, orchards, you name it. We all know that private property close to town, that's where all the deer like to live. You see them in most of the places around here, and lots of the private property places where there's houses and gardens and all sorts of plants and different things they like to eat. More deer like to hang around there. So take that for what it's worth. But those are some key things that I took out of the study that they did. And Jack, if you have a question or something, just, you know, don't hesitate to interrupt me here.
Oh, you're good.
Okay. All right. Can you guys see that? It should say primary food source. Can you see that, Jack?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So primary food source, I'm just going to first, you know, kind of establish what that is. And if you see down there, it says it's basically the food source that an animal shows preference to eating. This varies greatly upon the time of year, the habitat you're in, and the geographic region you're in. And I think that's one of the reasons why black-tailed deer are so hard to hunt, is because there's so much food available and it's constantly changing. Some plants are getting better, some are dying and withering away. Apples are falling off of trees all of a sudden out of the blue. And when these things happen, these animals are incredible. They know where it's at, when it's happening, when it's going to occur. And they're there all like on it, like, you know, like a coyote on a dead animal. Or it's just incredible how they find these things so quick, and it's changing and it's complex. And I don't know that we'll ever fully understand it, but I think that knowing that they have a preferred food source at different times of the year and that they really want to go to that, that is key in kind of understanding what they're doing. And so just to kind of tell you an example, I've got 4 apple trees behind my house here, and they usually fall in August. You know, some of they're coming off the tree right now. But I've seen deer, like when they very first start coming, no deer have been at all at my house. You know, I've seen them not far away, but then all of a sudden, like as soon as they start hitting the ground, boom, they're there eating them. And it's like, how do they know that's there? They haven't been walking there. They have an uncanny ability to find this food, or at least I don't think they're walking there. They probably have been at night. But all that being said, that just kind of goes to show you that. And then when those apples are gone, boom, I don't see them again. Who knows where they're at, you know? And that's just an example of their primary food source when it's there, and how they shift what they're doing for that food. So food is everything. I think that really dictates where an animal lives. And that's kind of what my things down there say, is that a deer often choose to live in an area that has a good primary food source. They also need security cover, and at different times of year, they need water. Here, obviously, we get a lot of rain. Once that comes, I don't think that really plays a factor at all. But in the summertime or drought year, that can definitely play a factor. It's thought that deer feed on average 3 to 5 times during a 24-hour period. That's kind of more off of whitetail information, but I think blacktails are the same. I've noticed that with elk. You know, they'll lay down for a while, but you know, 4 or 5 hours, even if they're not going to get up and go a long ways, they're going to get up and eat and stretch a little bit and lay back down. Primary food sources for blacktail deer will change frequently throughout the year depending on what forage is available. That's the key. Blacktail deer are browsers, and they can eat many of the plants available in Western Oregon. I've seen them eat so many different things, and we'll talk about that here in a bit. And there's a large diversity of food availability, and figuring out what the animal prefers, you know, is challenging, and it can change. Once you figure it out, it could change in a heartbeat. So that's why it's important to be out there in the field scouting, paying attention to those things, because as soon as the deer is doing something, a couple of weeks later, they can be doing something different. All right, I'm going to go to the next one. So let's see here. So food sources. Good examples of primary food sources. And everybody knows clear-cut deer like clear cuts. I mean, seems like when I started deer hunting, that's what you did. We're going to drive clear cuts. We're going to go blast clear cuts. And guys, kill bucks doing that. I don't, you know, after learning what we learned about their peak activity, I think they're in those clear cuts. The bucks are in 2 to 4 a.m. and I think they're out of them most days before daylight. But that being said, guys kill bucks in clear cuts, sometimes laying down there in the middle of the day. I mean, deer do random things, but I'll tell you, on public land, if there's a clear cut that you can drive to, you know, most guys have probably driven to it and looked in it and glassed in it. And if that's all you're going to do the whole time, I can tell you from experience when I've done it, you're going to have a lot of days where you're not seeing bucks. You might see does. And during the rut, that might change. You might get lucky and catch a buck with some of those does in a storm or during the middle of the day. But regardless, clear cuts, especially ones that are 2 to 3 years, to that 4 years of age, they haven't really grown trees up. There's lots of young plants growing in those clear cuts, and those young plants are rich in nutrients, and those are what the deer really like. That's why they like those cuts. They like new growth, whether they're browsing on, you know, like willow stems or anything, any new buds or new growth has high nutrient value to them, and it's desirable. And they need it. The areas that have more sunlight or an open canopy allows more plants to grow. And around here, they grow year round, some of them. So when one thing's growing really good in the summer and it's edible for a while, it might die off more in the fall. And then some other type of plant may be growing, and they're going to switch and try eating those. But the clear cuts have a lot of variety, and that's why they're so popular for the deer. Mass crops are another really popular thing. And if you listen there, look at whitetail information, they live and die by these mass crops, because all these trees drop stuff in the fall, and mainly acorns are what a lot of the people out east really key on. But Over here, we've got, other trees. We've got apples, plums, cherries. We do have oak trees in a good part of the state, mostly down in the south part of the state, but some up in the mid too. And I think even the valley has some oak trees with acorns too. When they drop is key. If they don't drop when you're hunting, they're not going to really be helpful. So those are things to key in on and to be aware of. But deer will shift their patterns when apple trees are dropping. If you know there's an orchard nearby, that could be a primary food source for them, where they're going in there at night and eating, or acorns. And I think how you can help recognize a primary food source, and we'll get into this more when we talk about reading sign, is that I've seen is really seeing, if you're seeing droppings in the area where they're eating, they're spending a significant amount of time. So if you're seeing lots of deer droppings there, that means they're there a lot and more than likely, if it's in the open in a clear cut, or if it's near something like this, they're most likely doing it at night. And you might even see some beds sometimes out there too, where they'll eat and they'll lay down and get up and eat some more. But that's usually done at night. Trees, shrubs, forbs, and herbaceous plants. This makes up the largest portion of their diet. It's a wide range of plants. I mean, I just kind of threw everything out there at once with that description. But, things like blackberry, there's lots of different varieties of blackberries. You've got the Himalayan blackberries, which are kind of the real invasive ones that were brought over here. There's lots of that around. Trailing blackberries are more like little isolated bushes. And then the wild ones with the red stem and dark green leaves, those ones are also, deer will eat all those. They like them all. Elderberry, salmonberry. Down in Southern Oregon, we found a spot that has a lot of wild rose, and you can see rose hips on there, and the deer were just absolutely hammering them. And was one of my better spots is when I found that. Salal, they'll eat that. Vine maple is a huge one that I look for up here on the coast for whatever reason. I think it's more the difficult nature of walking through vine maple that I think they like, but I found them bedding a lot in vine maple patches. Willows are common favorites, but the truth is they'll eat so many different plants, and there's tons of them here in Western Oregon. They'll eat poison oak. I've seen them eat alder leaves that are falling off the tree just on the ground. Other food sources down in Southern Oregon, mistletoe is a fungus that grows on trees, usually on oak trees, and Spanish moss grows in pine trees all over. But I've watched deer a lot of times when I'm on stand. I've watched them eat the moss. I haven't witnessed them eating mistletoe, but if you ever find any mistletoe that's fallen out of the tree, it's always annihilated by the deer. Like, it's eaten very quickly. And you can find trees, if you know what to look for on the mistletoe, you can start to identify it. And you'll see ones where clumps of it are hanging down low and the deer have completely eaten it off. So those are things to kind of look for. And then plants that grow on private property, cemeteries, residential areas. Obviously, you can't rifle hunt those areas, but areas that are close to whatever, they're close to a ranch, or those are areas that deer will really key in and feed on. In some areas, there's areas of public land areas that aren't far away that you can go and hunt. Especially as an archer, that opens it up to a little bit more of the opportunities for that. But those are all different good examples of food sources. And so let's keep rolling here. Secondary food sources. Primary and secondary food sources, they can be the same things, the same type of food. The difference between primary is it's like that's what the deer really wants at that time. And so they're going to eat it in the safest time of day, which is that 2 to 4 time period. Or, it's not hard and fast, but they're going to eat it under the cover of dark. And secondary food sources are food that they eat usually on their way to their primary food source. So if you think a deer's been bedded all day, it'll get up, it'll eat secondary food sources around its bed, and then it'll lay back down. And then when it decides to get up for the evening, it will get up and it'll stretch and it'll feed really slowly, usually at first until it's dark, and then they'll kind of move out and they'll feed more. So secondary food sources are just any other food that they're eating kind of on their way to their primary food source. And this is done frequently after a deer gets up from its bed. I just went over the example in the middle of the day. They're important because they usually, I really think these are really important because they usually are feeding on these during the day, like around their bedding area. And if, what I found is what deer and elk, I mean, if they have the ability to bed somewhere that's safe and secure and has food close by, that's where they're going to be. And black-tailed deer are definitely that way. They like to lay where they have, feed not far away. So they don't have to go a long ways. They can just get up and eat, and they can lay back down, and they don't have to put themselves at risk of, getting shot or running into a predator. And so that's why I think they're important to know, those areas, and to know that even though that's not their primary feeding area, if I know where they're bedding and I know there's good food nearby and I set up close to there, then, I'm going to have a good chance of getting a crack at them. And in relations to rifle hunting, if you have a spot that has, like, say it's like, 7 to 8-year-old or 10-year-old reprod, the trees are Christmas tree size, maybe a little bit bigger, but it's on a really steep hillside and you can see in there, and there's blackberry vines, and there's some of these secondary food sources that they like. They could be laying down in there and think that they're safe, but you from a distance can glass in there and see them. And the best rifle blacktail hunters I know, they're very patient on the glass, and they're usually looking in spots like that. All right, so large location, this is key right here. So this is a good takeaway here. Locations with a big variety or large variety of plant species will almost always have deer. And a lot of times they'll have deer year round, because it's just like if you're at the buffet, I know if Jack goes to the buffet and they only have cottage cheese and salad there, he might go there a little bit, but he's not going to want to be there for very long. But when they got all the fixins, they got everything to choose from. Heck, he'll come eat there every day, right? Well, the deer are no different. I mean, if they have more choices, there's going to be something that's going to be edible throughout the years. When something else is dead, something else is there for them to be able to take part of it. So I always like a variety of habitat as well. So if you can find a spot that's got timber, it's got reprod, it's got a clear cut, and they're in close proximity, those areas are going to have a variety of plant species, and the deer are going to have quite a few options there for security, for feed, and for just picking through whatever they want. So let's see if I went through this. Yeah, I talked about alder leaves. Oh, one thing I witnessed on my trail cameras, I have some set up in the timber where there's these they're like little clover sprouts. You've seen them. They just look like they're just like a little clover. I honestly don't know what they are, but I've had pictures of deer just sitting there like for 10 minutes and just eating every one of those. And I don't think they like them all year long, but in the wintertime or like late season, I think when it gets really cold, if you imagine a clear cut, a lot of the food's been browsed on really hard. Later in the year, it starts to die off, heavy rains, and then it freezes and gets really cold. Those plants don't do real well. But in the timber where there's thermal protection, it's not as cold there. There's plants still growing because they're protected from that cold temperature. And some of those smaller plants like that is when I've seen them really key in on that. They'll later in the year, there's less feed around, so they might have to move more to find it. They browse a lot on stems and of different plants, and I've heard that they eat Doug fir, which I'm like, I just have a hard time seeing them do that. But I mean, I'm sure they do. They can pretty much eat a lot of things. So, but think about this when you're hunting an area, and this will help you observe what plants are available and which ones are being browsed on. If you haven't looked to see what it looks like when a plant is browsed on, if you've got a garden or anybody, just look at the ends of the plants. It looks like somebody went and took a weed whacker and just chopped them off. I mean, you can see where deer have taken bites off the end of the plants. And if you're not paying attention to that stuff, which I wasn't for years, I was just walking around the woods just aimlessly, didn't know what was even going on. But that's one of the big takeaways that I'll talk about it a little bit later, but it's just being observant of that stuff.
Yeah. And then Matt, when you're looking to figure out what they're eating on time of year, are you just looking to see if there's like fresh sign like scat and other stuff with the eating plants? Because like I know sometimes you walk by a bunch of salmon berries and it's like, wow, the elk have been mowing on this, but that was probably 2 months ago.
Yes. Yeah. And it's hard to tell. You can kind of tell when it's been old. If you see if you see it enough, if it's green on there, then like if it's still, you can tell the plant's still alive where it was bitten off, then you know it's not that long ago. But if it's been like during bow season, it dries up and it's white, and you can see it like kind of, you can tell that it's been there for a while and it's not like it was freshly eaten off. So those are little details you can tell. Dropping, sometimes it's hard to know, is it elk or is it deer? Because the cuts that I've been in that have been completely mowed down are definitely elk. Elk will mow down a cut like way more than a deer will. And if you're hunting a blacktail buck or like trying to find where he's feeding, it's not going to look like that. It's not going to be super obvious. You might see, all you need to see is like, okay, there's some browsing going on here. They are eating here. And if I'm seeing like big buck turds, or larger droppings, that to me in a big track is going to mean more to me about, I need to hang a camera in here or I need to spend a little more time in here. That means more to me than just seeing a bunch of plants that are mowed down. But if I'm trying to find a good, like we'll talk about hunting the does and finding where there's good doe groups and where they really like to be super important too. So it depends on the time of the year you're hunting. And I think maybe we can talk about, well, yeah, I mean, we can talk about it now. I mean, this stuff that I'm talking about is really important if you're going to hunt early archery season or you're going to hunt the beginning of rifle season, like right now. Honestly, right now, the deer, their testosterone's building. They're starting to rub trees. They're starting to get ready for does. So this is becoming less important, and knowing where the does are. I mean, this is still important, but it's important to know where the does are doing this, right? Because the bucks are going to be surveying and checking in on them once this rut really kicks off here in the next couple of weeks. So we can maybe touch on that a little bit more. I have more of that kind of later, but does that help a little bit?
Absolutely. Yeah, that's good.
All right. So let's see. Let me go back up here. I think I skipped on one here. So we did the food source examples. We did that. Secondary food sources, we did that. And so here's where we're getting into the bedding. And it really, for me, it really is all about the bedding, whether you're hunting bucks or whether you're hunting does. We're hunting during the daytime. And I would be willing to bet we don't have any information from that study on this, but they're not active during the day. Bucks really aren't most of the time. I mean, during the rut, I think that's a big exception and they didn't have that data. But they're usually laying down during the day. Even the does, most of the does, they'll get up and feed a lot more during the day than a buck will, especially on public land, I think, or at least out in open eyes. I mean, the buck will get up, but I think he's in a secure area. So it really is about the bedding. I really think focusing on this will help improve your hunting of them, as if you have this in mind when you're thinking about where you're going and what you're doing. Everyone that's hunted blacktail deer knows that they love to be in the thick cover. That's why it makes them so hard. On public land where there's hunting pressure, this couldn't be more true. Where I live up here in Astoria, it's in the Saddle Mountain unit. There's lots of excellent hunters up here, rifle hunters, hardcore guys that are out every day. There's people in cuts everywhere. And if a deer is going to live, he is not going to show his face in one of those clear cuts, because if he does, he's going to either get killed, he's going to get wounded, or he's going to get shot and missed or scared back into the brush, and he's not going to want to go do it again. So I think that's a lot of the places that most of you guys probably hunt. If you hunt public land, I mean, it's pretty hard. And so you've got to think about this when you're targeting these deer. These deer are smart and they know how to survive. And so you've got to think about where they're spending most of the time during the day. Many folks think the deer can bed and feed anywhere. I thought this when I watched whitetail hunters. I'm like, oh, that's stupid. They're sitting on a field in a big old, feeder out there or in a box blind. Of course, that's the only trees. That's where they have to bed. They have to come eat here. Over here, they can bed and do that and feed anywhere. And there's some truth to that, but that is a lie that's going to basically inhibit you from really learning about these deer if you hold on to it. And I held on to it for way too long. And I think that there are definitely areas that these deer prefer to feed, and there's definitely areas they prefer to bed. And the sooner you start to really try to learn those things in the areas that you hunt, the better you're going to be, and the more successful you're going to be, in my opinion. But so with that being said, yeah, that's basically all I have on that. Let's go to the next one. So how do we identify bedding areas? And the short answer is you've got to get your boots on the ground. You've got to go out and hike and get into some nasty, thick brush and look for them, and you'll find them. That's the short answer. But there are other ways. I've found some. Sometimes I can guess on e-scouting, on aerial imagery and topography, and have a good idea. But for deer, it's much harder. For elk, north-facing slope, yeah, that's where they bed. Bench on a steep north-facing slope, out in eastern Oregon, or in some of these places where it's hot and dry. That's the cool area during the hot time of year. That's where they're going to be. Well, these deer have lots of thick, secure areas that, Western Oregon is just a giant brush patch. So it's hard to find them. But here's some of the observations that I found. Maybe they'll be helpful for you. In general, I've observed that areas with ample or lots of security cover, the deer usually will bed closer to their primary food source than areas where the security cover is more sparse. This is kind of that example I gave in Wyoming. They'll traveling 4 miles because their best cover was super far away from where they like to be. And this is the same with deer in Western Oregon. This is what makes them so hard. They're, coming into my yard at night. I don't even know they're there, but they're probably bedding, I do know they're bedding. They're probably only bedding not even a quarter mile behind my house. And because I went and I found their beds, and when they're coming here. And so the thicker the area, the more security there is. They have lots of places to hide, and they can go get that feed easy at night, and they're not going to be as far. So the coast, it's going to be much closer than the Cascades is what they found. I really think that if you find a good primary food source, you find an apple tree or an apple orchard, or maybe some old wild apple trees, and apples are dropping, and the deer are there, you see droppings, and the apples are there right now, I know they're there, then you're going to want to find the closest, most secure, nastiest spot that these deer could bed there. And that's usually where they're at. And that could be several different things. So once I identify a good food source, I verify first that the deer are using them. And I check for browse lines, like we talked about, droppings and tracks. Then I'll look on a map. Usually I'll look on onX or on I'll give you a few others, Hill Map or CalTopo, and I'll find the closest area that's really difficult. It could be very steep. It could be covered in blackberries or super thick and seem impenetrable. It's a spot that if you go to it, you go like, I don't want to go in there. There's no reason for me to go in there. It looks like nothing would ever go in there. And nobody's ever been in there. I don't want to go there. And that's usually where their beds are at. And a lot of times it's crazy. I'm like, a deer couldn't even get in here. I'm like walking through it, and I'm like, I don't even know why I'm going back here. Like I just went through a salmonberry patch the other day, and it was just because I had to go through it. And when I got in there, there was, boom, there's a deer bed, and it was like secured with all this thick salmonberry and vine maple, and it was just like horrible to go through it. But when I got in there, there was beds in there, and that's kind of how the bedding areas are from what I've seen. They're in areas that humans typically won't go. So keep that in mind. If it's in the Cascades, I don't think it's, it might not be as thick. I think they use topography more to their advantage. It's more steep ground. They have more hills. They'll bed more on ridge points like elk can do. If you've hunted elk out east or anywhere, they use their nose a lot to survive. And they'll bed in areas where they have, the wind in their advantage. And so just kind of keep that in mind. It really depends on where you're at. It doesn't have to be super thick. If it's the coast, it's going to be thick. You can bet that. But if it's the Cascades, It might be areas that are on a really steep hillside and there's a little tiny bench way off the top, and then there's no roads there, and the only way to get there is to hike up a steep hill or drop into this place that people don't want to drop into. So look for those areas, and you got to get out on the ground and look for these beds. And you can find beds. I'll show you here an example of that here in a second. So e-scouting I talked about. Talked about if you think a person would never walk in that spot, go check it. You got to do reverse psychology. If you listen to yourself, be like, I don't want to do that, then that means you want to do it. And if you want to go in there because there's a nice trail and it's easy ridge to walk down, you don't want to go there. So think of that when you're looking for these areas. Steep areas, thick reprod on the edge of timber. Seen this a lot on the coast. So if there's nice timber that's pretty mature, and if there's ferns that are waist or chest high, and that butts up to some thick reprod, and there's some type of elevation or drainages in that, I've seen deer bed there a ton. And a lot of times they like to put their back up against that thick jungle reprod that nothing wants to walk through, and they'll look out over the ferns. And I'll get to this, but they're really utilizing all three of their senses. They can hear anything that's walking through the ferns or in the brush behind them. They can see through that open timber. So if they see something out there, they can, avoid it that way. And then oftentimes they also have the wind. A lot of times will be either coming from the back or coming in an area where they can't see. And so they're trying to utilize those things to their advantage. So vine maple, salmonberry, huckleberries on the coast. These are key areas that I see deer bedding in, does and bucks frequently. The ends of ridge points and benches on steep hillsides are really good spots. And if I'm down in Southern Oregon, I'm going to key in on those a little bit more, because the thickest areas they have there are not that thick. So I think they use the wind and their sight to their advantage a little bit more, where these blacktails, I think they really rely on noise a lot when they're bedding, because they can just crawl in the brush and they can hear anything moving in it. So take that for what it's worth. So here's an example. You can see this picture here. This is a buck bed that the buck that I killed last year, this is actually one of the beds that he liked to use. And you can see how worn in that thing is. I knew that there was a good primary source in the area. I knew that this was an area that rifle hunters would not hunt, because you can't glass it, you can't see it. And if you try to hike in it, it's pretty horrible. But there are some little openings in there, and not far from there, there's a good primary food source that they may or may not use during different times of the year. But regardless, I found these beds. There was probably 3 or 4 beds that they could be 150 to 200 yards apart and in different areas. And this is the one I think he used the most. I didn't put a camera on this when I was hunting him, but this year I threw a camera on it, and 2 days later I had a fork and horn buck that came in, and it's about 10:30 in the morning. This was in July, and came in late in it. And then my camera somehow wigged out, so I didn't get any more pictures. It stopped working, but you can see, much like if you've ever hunted a mule deer and you watch where they bed, you'll go in those worn in beds. I mean, they've used those beds year in, year out. The deer know where they're at. They know where it's safe. Now this can change. If this gets logged, obviously he's not going to bed there anymore. So that's the frustrating thing about hunting the coast that I found. As soon as you get in there and get figured out, then they log it, and boom, it all changes, and you're back to the drawing board. So that's the hard part of hunting the west side of Oregon. But we talked about their 3 things they like to use when they're bedding to their advantage: smell, sound, sight. White-tailed deer, they use their nose way more than any deer I've ever hunted. They're always bedded with a wind advantage. And if you've ever followed other content, whitetail content, if you don't, I'd highly recommend it. People knock it all the time, but I've learned 10 times more from whitetail hunters than I've learned from anybody that I know around here. And they know deer better than we know deer. They hunt deer in a way that's understanding them on a way deeper level, and they have more information at their hands. But Blacktail deer are different. They don't move as much, but they're really not that different. They're doing the same things biologically. Their needs are the same. And so we just have to kind of, take in what we can from them and apply it to what we're doing. And that's what I've done. And it's been a lot of fun. So that being said, to talk about the smell advantage, I think this is interesting if you guys haven't ever heard this, but deer oftentimes, if they are bedded on a ridge, they will typically bed on the leeward side of a ridge. And I didn't come up with this. If you've ever heard of Beast, Dan Infald, or the Beast hunting tactics, he's the one who really pioneered this. And there's lots of guys that have since followed it and have proven a lot of it to be true. But that being said, it varies and they're wild animals. So what it is though, is basically, if you could imagine a prevailing wind. So here we get mostly a southwest or west, northwest prevailing wind most of the time on the west side of Oregon. So if I have a ridge that's running north and south, and I've got wind coming over the west, from the west coming up over to the east, a lot of those deer, if they are going to want the wind in their favor, they're going to bed on the east side of that ridge. And the reason for that being is that the wind comes up and over, and then on the back side of that, especially in timber, which we have a lot of here, the wind will kind of not be as strong there, and they'll actually, like during the middle of the day when they're laying, there'll be a thermal rise, and so they'll have air coming up to them below them, and then they'll have wind coming up over the top and behind them, and so they're really pretty bulletproof from a wind standpoint, that they can smell two places at one time. And then a lot of times their back's against something thick, they can see down below them, and if they're in the ferns, they can hear what's going to walk anywhere within 100 yards of them, and they're gone before you even get there, unless you're super slow and you're walking sounding like a deer, or you're doing something. I think a lot of times deer are gone before you even get there around here, because they have so many advantages. But that being said, that's the wind to their advantage, and trying to figure out where they bed. I don't know if it holds up as much here with blacktail, because like I said, I think they rely on sound a lot more than smell, but they definitely do use wind to their advantage. Ferns, I really see them laying in ferns a lot, and brushy areas where they can hear, things moving. One of the places, let's see. So this, at the very last sentence there, it says a creek header ridge ridge points. This is a spot where I've seen them bed a ton. And so if you could imagine the head of a drainage, you've got like little finger drainage, finger drainage, they're all coming together. In between those drainages, there's little tiny finger ridges. And I'm talking, this is micro topography. You can't see it on a topo map. These are only like, the creek bottom's like 20 yards down, but there's just a little tiny finger ridge that goes out and it drops off. Well, a lot of times around here on the coast, those areas, if it's in the timber, this is in the timber I'm talking about with big ferns, and there's usually some blowdown and vine maple. It's really hard to navigate through all that stuff. And if you go out on that ridge point, they'll bed right on that point, and they can see across each side of the drainage. There's ferns, so they can hear really good, and they have a great escape route. So if they see something coming from one direction, boom, they bound off and they're gone the other way, or vice versa. And I've seen that. I've seen it on multiple occasions. I found beds in those areas. And so that's another spot that you could look for if you're looking for bedding. I hope I'm not boring you guys with all this.
No, Matt, all I'm learning is that these deer are impossible to kill.
No, they aren't, because the rut is where, which is what we're getting to right now. Good segue. Is where these bucks, they lose their life. They lose their mind. And so, in early September, I think it's good to know this, bucks will hang together in the summer. Sometimes they'll be solo, but they don't mind being with each other in bachelor groups, much like mule deer. And then once they shed the velvet, I think all you guys probably know this, they don't like being around each other. The reason for this is the testosterone levels in them rise, and they prove this biologically. And that's why their body starts changing. That buck that I showed at the very beginning was the same buck that I had a picture of earlier. And it's just crazy the difference of them from the summer to when we get to hunt them in the rut. They look almost like a completely different animal by their face colorations, their coat, their swollen neck, and all that happens because of testosterone. And so their focus becomes less about, these primary food sources, and more about, establishing their rutting ground or wherever they're going to be breeding does. And it's usually not far from wherever they for the blacktails on the coast. Sometimes I think they would travel far. This really varies, I think, and is probably a great topic for theory, for discussing, but I definitely don't know. But my own theory is that, if a buck has a core area that he lives in the summer and he's kind of spending his time there, if the closest area that has the most concentration of does is where he's going to probably rut, most likely. I've seen that with elk, and I've seen summertime pictures of elk, and I can find the closest group of cows. That's how we found one of the biggest bulls we ever hunted. We had pictures of him in the summer, and I found the closest area that had the most cows in it, and it was 2 miles away. And that's where we ended up getting into him, which is nothing for an elk. But that being said, I think it's the same for deer. And so they're going to start establishing their area, and they're going to start marking their area with scent by rubbing trees. They do use licking branches like a whitetail does. And I've seen a few scrapes. I don't think they do it quite like a whitetail does, where they dig it out and paw it out, but they definitely all use like pea spots that are basically, they're like a scrape, but we can't really see them because they don't sit there and tear it up like a whitetail does. But they'll go and they squat their hind legs and they pee there and they leave their scent there. And I think other bucks will come and do that too, because I've had licking branches where multiple bucks will come and leave their scent on it, and they'll go and piss there. I've witnessed that on my cameras. So they're definitely doing that, and they're doing that mostly right before the peak of the rut. And I'm going to make sure I'm going to cover this slide first before I keep going here. Let's see. So bucks I've hunted on the coast seem to have a peak breeding activity the first week of November. So what I've seen is the Cascades, Southern Oregon, higher elevation, they have a later rut. It seems like the deer rut there later. I think it's more advantageous for them too, because some of those deer are wintering. They're moving for a winter range. And if they have a fawn too early, that fawn won't survive and then pass on the genes to rut during that time. So I typically think that that's why it's later. But most guys that hunt both those, I've talked to lots of people, they all agree. Like the coast, where I'm at, the rut's really early. I've got video of a doe being bred October 25th. Where I think down south and in the Cascades, that those does probably, most of them are getting bred probably around Thanksgiving, maybe even after that, into the first week of December. I'm sure you guys all know, I'm not going to really talk too much about that. So the time before the rut is my personal favorite time to hunt. And it's because these deer are just starting to mark their territory. They're on their feet. And I didn't get this slide ready, but it's fine. I can tell you guys it. So there's been lots of studies on whitetails when their peak movement is, and it's distance traveled. It's not time when they're on their feet. So it's actually covering ground. And what they found is that they're, without a doubt, obviously, we know they cover the most ground during the rut. But more specifically, if you really look at the graphs, and I've looked at lots of different studies with different graphs, all of them, the ones I've looked at, the deer cover more ground before the rut peaks. And it's because there's no does in heat, and they're having to check those bedding areas. They're having to survey and mark the land, and they're really trying to make sure I'm doing everything I can so that I get a chance to breed. And that puts them on their feet more. And I think that's why it's my favorite time to hunt. And my cameras have shown that too. Up here on the coast, I would say my favorite time is like October 23rd through the Halloween is when I really see that more bucks are on their feet during daylight. My cameras have really confirmed that. Down in like Southern Oregon, I think that the migration's going on, and same with the Cascades in Eugene and in some of those other areas. Deer are migrating down, and I think there's a lot more variation. So you might see a longer stretch of rut activity, and it could start early and it could go later. But that being said, I still like it before, because I think those does, if you've heard lockdown, they talk about lockdown in the whitetail world. That's when a buck, once he gets on a doe that's an estrus and he's going to breed her, he doesn't leave her side for about 2 days. And so that's not a bad thing if she's running through a clear cut right and I'm glassing. But a lot of times what I've witnessed is those bucks know that it's dangerous. I don't know if they know it's dangerous or what, but they will, or if it's more like, I'm going to keep her in my area, but I think that they will take that hot doe and they will take her to a protected area and he'll be with her until he breeds her. And then he's on to the next one. And I think sometimes she'll resist and they'll go for a runabout. And that's probably when he's going to die. But that being said, those are theories of mine and they could be completely wrong, but it makes sense to me. So that's my favorite time. I do believe that bucks do a lot of this activity during the middle of the day. So that spike that he talked about, the biologist said they saw it from noon to 1 during the other times of the year. I think you would see it, and my cameras have proved that. I have lots of areas where I have cameras. Granted, they are near bedding areas, so I will give you that. But I've noticed from 10 to 2, that's my best action during the rut during the day for bucks. I would rather hunt in the middle of the day, close to those bedding areas, than first thing in the morning or last thing at night. And I killed my buck last year. It was 3 p.m. I was going to sit from 10 till 3. I got in there early because I didn't want to disrupt anything, but I didn't get out of my stand. And I was going to get out at 3 and I shot him at 2:56. So it came by just in time, but it was 70 degrees that day. Not a breath of wind. I should have been golfing, I thought, but it paid off to be out there because I knew that from my cameras from the previous years had showed that. So let's go to the next one because I think that I covered all that. And if we're going too late, I guess we're an hour into it. I only have a few more slides, so I'll try to speed it up here. We've talked about some of this. So I really key in on pinch points and funnels within the bedding areas. And I try to find, a topographical funnel is something like a saddle. So if you know there's like a hill and a hill, the dip between it, a lot of times deer would like to travel through the saddle. That's a very basic topographical funnel. And for blacktails, I don't really focus on saddles that much. There is one spot that we've had good luck with, but all in all, I'm looking more for like really steep. The best funnels I found for blacktails, like if you see a really steep creek drainage, like the head of a creek drainage, and there's just one little drainage starting off and it takes off and it's so steep that you physically can't even cross it there. And the deer will loop up above it and they'll always kind of cut above it. And a lot of times you'll find a trail up above it. And I have a spot that I'm going to try to hunt this year. The last year I had a camera on and I had 3 or 4 different bucks using it during daylight. And it was kind of between 2 good primary food sources. And I think that they were just cruising those, looking for does during the day. And so that's an example of a topographical funnel, is that pinch point there. A terrain funnel is blacktails like habitat, edge habitat. I'm sure you guys know that already. They like, the edge of timber and the oaks or reprod and timber. They kind of, for whatever reason, they either like laying there or sometimes they like moving along those edges. And so if I see areas where those things intersect, like I see, timber edges that intersect, that's something that I would key in on. Intersecting trails near bedding areas, those are good areas. And then edges of habitat change, we talked about that. So if I can find a spot that's close to bedding, it has a topographical funnel and a terrain or a habitat like funnel as well, and there's intersecting trails there, that is gold. Like that is guaranteed deer are coming by there frequently because they have to move there because of the terrain. They have to move there because of the topography and they're bedding close to it. That is the type of spot that I'm trying to find and key in on to kill these bucks. So those areas, I'll tell you right now, they're hard to find. They're out there, and for every 20 spot, I ran cameras for like 6 years here when I moved to the coast, and these deer are the hardest deer I've ever hunted because they don't move very much, and what I found is they're living right under your nose, and you don't even know they're there unless you're really looking for the signs. One of the most noteworthy signs that will tip you off that a nice buck's there are rubs. And that's the easiest one to find, the most visual. And so, this year, if you've seen rubs while you're hunting, then there's a buck in that area. You got to start to think about, where do I think he spent most of the day? What is he doing? But one of my favorite things to do is after season, when there's no hunting going on and the foliage is all down, is to go. That's when I like to do my scouting. I can see all the trails really good. The blackberry leaves and brush is all down. You can walk through it easier. You can see beds. You can see rubs. And you can learn ground really well during that time. So like I said, rubs are a good tip off. And I don't know, this could be wrong, but I kind of, what I feel like what I've seen is areas where I've seen lots of rubs, to me, that signifies multiple bucks in an area. I know that's not a hard, fast rule. There might be a buck with a personality that just loves to shred stuff up and he might just rub a ton. But areas where I've seen lots of rubs, I typically see multiple bucks in that area. And if I'm not seeing many rubs or I only see one rub, it might just be one buck in that area. And it could still be worth looking at, because like the area I killed my buck, there were some rubs in there, but it wasn't necessarily torn up. And, but I was getting a lot of daylight pictures of that buck. And so I think that's what makes hunting these things really hard, is they, you know, the sign is subtle. A big track means a lot. A big rub means a lot. Beds mean a lot. Droppings mean a lot. But, you know, like seeing a ton of deer in open areas isn't something that's going to make me, you know, if I see that, I'm definitely going to look at that area, but everybody else and their brother's going to look at it too. So keep that in mind. I am a good rambler, aren't I, Jack?
Tough, man.
So, yeah, go for it. I'm just going to try to get through these. These are different methods that you can use to hunt blacktail, pretty much just about anything. So glassing, spot and stalk, this is probably what most rifle hunters do. And there's great success with that. Key in on those areas that they're going to be comfortable being in during the day, and where deer like to spend time during the day, where they can easily feed and bed during the day, and be patient, and you're going to have some luck there. Still hunting, you guys know what that is. You're sneaking through the woods. I know a gentleman, Jack's good friends with, who that's how he prefers to hunt blacktails, and he'll do it in August with a bow, and it's crunchy and noisy out. I don't know how he kills stuff, but he does, and he does it with a stick bow. So still hunting is effective. You just have to be very patient and very confident about where you're going through. You have to know that there are deer there, and you have to really go slow. There's some tactics we could talk about with all this stuff, could be an entire discussion, but rattling and calling. I do like rattling. At the biggest buck that I've killed, I rattled in from my stand. And calling, I have done a little bit of calling, but rattling to me, I've had more success with than calling. I know some guys with like doe bleats and buck grunts have had good luck. I usually have a call, but I haven't had any real great success with it, although I'm not opposed to trying it. Ambush hunting, this is my favorite style hunting for blacktail deer. It's basically you set up a spot to sit, a high percentage spot in a ground blind tree stand. I like to use a tree saddle. You can just sit on the ground in natural cover. But ambush hunting, I think, is one of the best ways to hunt these deer, because they just don't move a lot. And so you've got to be very patient. Tracking in the snow, you know, if you get up in the Cascades, I know some guys, Wayne Endicott, if you guys know him from the bow rack, I believe that they track bucks in the snow, and they rely a lot on that. I don't know that they're necessarily following tracks to them, but they're up in the snow, and you can utilize tracking, even not in the snow too, if you really work on it. And that can be a fun way to hunt too. Baiting. This is how I see most guys hunting blacktail deer. And I'm not being judgmental, because I tried baiting when I was trying to figure this out as well. But I really think this is where most guys are going wrong with hunting. For one, it's a lot of work, and it's not an easy thing. You spend a ton of time sitting there, and really all you're doing is establishing a primary food source for the deer. If you do it like these guys that really, they do it, you know, they put apples out for 2 months straight, and these deer know the apples are there, and the does are coming there all the time, and the bucks are hitting them too. But I think most of those guys would agree that they're mainly hitting them at night after the hours of dark. Now, that's not a hard, fast rule. I know guys shoot them during the day all the time, but if you're hunting public land and have deer that are pressured and you're trying to bait them, I would say most of your action is going to be at night. If you're on private property and you're able to really control the pressure and stay out of there and let them like feed there during the day, then you can. But to me, it's like, what are you really learning about the deer? All you're doing is trying to take one of their most essential things, which is trying to find food for survival, and you're just, kind of keying in on that. And I'm not saying that in a judgmental way because I've done it, but I found myself not really enjoying the hunting process when I'm sitting there over apples or a corn pile. The other one is the deer are a lot more jumpy when they come in. I mean, they're way more likely to jump the string. A lot of times you're more likely to have to take a shot right at dark. And, it's just not an ideal shooting scenario where if you're set up on one of these transition areas close to bedding, the deer has no clue you're there. He has no suspected moment of danger or anything, and you get a lot better shot opportunity. So take that for what it's worth, but baiting is an effective tactic. If I were going to bait, which I can't ethically, even though it's legal in Oregon, I just can't bring myself to do it. And I think it's so much more fun trying to figure these animals out and to really hunt them on their terms. But if I was going to do it, I would probably, establish that primary food source, and I would figure out what the deer is doing coming to there, and I would try to hunt according to that, not on the site. I would hunt off of it. Using scents. I do use scents on licking branches and stuff like that. I've only found a couple licking branches for blacktail deer. They're very hard to identify. If you've hunted whitetail and you've seen a scrape and you've seen a licking branch, which I hadn't until last year, I think that you could spot them a lot easier. But deer, they do go and they rub branches. I have one that the best one that I found was, it was just on a dug fir tree, and there was all these old boughs coming out, and there's moss on all of them, except for this one that kind of came out in the trail. And it was, they're usually about waist to chest height. And there wasn't an ounce of moss on it. It was kind of almost looked like it was rubbed or polished. And I'm like, I wonder if that is. And so I set up a camera on it, and sure enough, last year I had 10 different bucks come in there during the last 2 weeks of October, first 2 weeks of November. And I actually had a video of a doe getting bred right by it too. So they definitely use it for communication. And since we can't use natural deer scents, it's illegal in Oregon, but buck fever synthetics is what I like to use. It's a synthetic scent. It's 100% legal. And I don't think that it really brings them to it. I think if you've heard of guys making mock scrapes, I've tried that for deer with some success, and sometimes it doesn't work. But if you have a good area that the deer are frequenting, and you can get a natural branch hanging down about head height, and I usually put like their forehead gland on there. People will spray vanilla extract. I mean, just anything for them to want to smell it and rub and get their own scent on it. Then other deer might do it as well. I haven't had any luck hunting one of those and actually killing something on it. But that being said, I haven't really sat the ones that I found either. I was kind of hunting other areas and other bucks. So this is the big takeaway, this bold statement at the bottom. This is something that if I could convey something that I feel like I've learned that might be helpful to anybody out there, is I always try to consider what the weather conditions are during that day before I go hunting to help me decide what tactic I'm going to use for that day. And I want to talk about this for a second because I think it'll make sense. So if I go out hunting and it's, the first week of November, I'm excited about the bucks are going to be rutting. I've done this before. I got down to Southern Oregon and it's 75, 80 degrees during the day, not a breath of wind. And the weather is just horrible all week long. Well, if I'm doing that, it's like still hunting and walking around through the woods. Is that going to do me any good? Like, I'm not patient enough and I don't know where the deer are enough to be able to still hunt my way into something. So that one's checked off the list. Glassing, I could glass from a distance, but even if I spot it, if I'm hunting with a bow, am I going to be able to get around on it? Probably not. Rattling, my sound's going to carry longer. Heck, I'm going to rattle. That's something I like to do when the days like that, when the conditions are like that. Ambush hunting, it's a good tactic. Really, you'll find that that's a good tactic for any weather condition, whether it's stormy and the deer are moving, or it's calm and not much is going on. Ambush hunting is great. Tracking, snow. If it snowed a bunch, I'm like, man, maybe I'm just going to go cover ground and try to find some tracks, and it might lead me into a new area that's promising. Baiting, yeah, you can do that all year long. That's gonna not really be affected by the conditions. If it's raining, using scents, that's not something I'm really doing for hunting anyway. It's just something you can use with these other tactics. So take that for what it's worth. If it's stormy out, still hunting's a great time to be out walking through the woods. You walk right up on stuff when it's windy and blowing. Rattling, that's not a good time to rattle. You don't want to go rattle on call when it's stormy and windy out. Seems like common sense, so I'm going to stop talking about it. You guys probably already are aware of that. So here is the big one, scouting. I think this is what makes and breaks people. If you scout for animals, you're going to have a lot better success. If you don't go out in the woods until it's hunting season, you're just starting the whole game before when it starts. And that's what most people probably do. But this is probably the most important stuff that I do that would help me be successful. And so I organized this sign in what I think is from most important to least. And obviously this is just my own little categorization, so take it for what it's worth. But droppings are super important to me. And because what that equals to me is time spent in that location. If it's just a random dropping and I don't see any others, I don't take much note of it. But if I get in an area and there's 10, 15 things of droppings in a 200 or 300 square yard area, then I know that deer are they're spending time in here. And then I'm going to think, if it's in a clear cut or a feeding area, I know it's mostly at night. If it's in a thicker reprod area, I know it's mostly during the day. And so that's going to allow me to key in on there. Okay, now am I seeing tracks? There's tracks here, there's trails here. Where I killed my buck last year, I saw a big track, and that made me want to throw a camera up, and that I ended up getting a picture of the buck. Beds will tell me, okay, they're laying there. I've seen beds in clear cuts, beds in people's yards, beds in areas where they're laying down at night. So you have to establish, is this a daytime bed? Is it a nighttime bed? But beds are important. Browse lines we talked about, Jack, and seeing that feeding that we were talking about. I like to try to figure out, are there deer tracks in there? Does it look like there's deer here? Or do I think this is elk? Because if it's really beat down, like I said, it's probably elk. But I've seen areas that are torn apart with deer sign too. Trails, you're driving down the road and you're in a reprod patch, there's blackberries, it looks pretty bucky, and you're seeing just trails cut through the vines coming off the hills. That's an indicator right there. Okay, there's deer here. I just need to get out and find where they're going. Licking branches and scrapes we talked about. Rubs, I find rubs in intersections near bedding areas or out in feeding areas where deer are kind of frequently going. It seems like that's where they like to rub. So I will hunt in proximity to rubs, but it's not like, oh, there's a rub here, I'm going to sit and hunt right over it. I don't think that at all. I want to take in all the information. And if that rub's in a good pinch point close to bedding, and it seems like deer are moving through there, then that's a spot that I would hunt. Resources I use for scouting, trail cameras have been huge for me. They are what I've used to confirm and learn a lot of what I've really been observant of that. In the past, I've ran about 20 cameras. I usually run them all year long, and I move them in different locations all year. This year, I'm getting away from trail cameras because I feel like I'm understanding them more now. And I feel like they can be a hindrance too, because sometimes a deer will walk 10 feet from your camera and not get a picture, and he'll be there frequently. And you can be like, oh, I'm not hunting him because I didn't get any pictures of him. So you don't want to be 100% reliant on your trail cameras. And I think most people that use them really are. And I think I have been that way too. And I think that that's, if we're looking at the sign, like the droppings of tracks and stuff like that, and we're doing it real time, so we know that they're in there at the time when I'm hunting, I'm going to have confidence to know the deer are here. I just need to spend time in here. Onyx, you guys all know that. Hill Map's a good one. It shows topo and it shows aerial imagery side by side, and you can click a spot on the aerial imagery and it'll bring it up on the topo. So if I'm find a topo funnel, I'll click on it and then I'll see where it is. And if I see two edges of timber coming together on that same spot, I know, hey, I need to go check that out. Spotlighting, I don't really do this much, but if I was really wanting to kill the biggest buck in the county and do it in a legit manner, I would go out during the summer And maybe even now, if you don't have a weapon, it's not illegal to spotlight, from my understanding. And don't quote me on that, but this is what I've heard, is if you don't have a weapon, you can do it. But if you went out at night, you could potentially find that big buck that you're trying to hunt. And once you know where he's feeding, then you could start to key in on some of these things we talked about and finding where he's bedding. Glassing during the summer months, this is probably the main way that I find bucks. July is my favorite month. I feel like that's when they're out in the open feeding in the cuts the most. And that'll tell me that a big buck's in the area. But that being said, by the time rut rolls around, it could be quite a ways away from there. You know, if it's in the Cascades, it might not be relevant at all to go scouting in July because they're up high in the high country. And then come November, you know, they could be, you know, 20 miles down a ridge down in the lowland where the does are at. And they're finding that on their radio collar studies from what we've heard. Wind mapping. This is something I hadn't even heard of till like this year. And I've done it to some extent, but I'll tell you a story that's really kind of cool with this. But wind mapping is just like when you find an area and I know, okay, this is my pinch point within the bedding. I know that they like this spot. I'm going to go sit there. Then I need to learn what the wind is doing there so that I don't blow them out. And so you want to go in there during a day when you have the prevailing wind, like, you know, if it's normally a westerly wind, I want to go in there on that day and I want to check and see what the wind's doing. On a day when we get an easterly or weird breeze, I want to go in there and check and see how different it is. So I know whether I can hunt it or not based off of what the wind is doing. Because if they do smell you, it's game over. And I had a spot where I killed my buck last year. The year before that, I had the same buck on a summer pattern, like right during the first week of bow season. I knew that if I got a strong westerly breeze, that I could go hunt where my stand was. And one day I got that. It was in the evening. He was coming out the last half hour. I had to be within 100 yards to 200 yards of where he was bedding. And he wasn't bed there all the time, but I would say out of 3 days, he would come by there at least a day or two. So it was a pretty good chance that he would come by if I sat there. And I went and got in my stand that evening. It was blowing hard in my face, and I knew he was going to be coming, you know, with the direction he was coming, my wind would be good. Well, one thing I didn't anticipate, a half hour before dark, it calmed down. The thermals took over and the wind switched, and the thermals started pulling down to the direction where I was going to shoot the deer. And 10 minutes before shooting light, when the buck normally comes by there, I hear, and he's in the woods snorting at me, and I never saw him. He never came out. But I'm confident that's the buck I killed because I killed him in the same spot, but I moved my stand on the downwind side, knowing that those thermals would switch. And I shot him in the afternoon, and my wind was good, and he came right through the same spot. And that was during the rut. He was moving in that. It was kind of, I think he was kind of going between some bedding areas when I got him. But so wind mapping is something you definitely want to do when you find a good spot. All right, I got 2 more slides. This is factors that affect deer movement, because if we're trying to hunt them when they move, I think these are things that we could keep in mind. There's been lots of research on this in the whitetail world, believe it or not, and they found that even above weather, the #1 thing that affects where deer move is hunting pressure. So, and it does not take them long to figure that out. Once the season starts and they get pressured or they get bumped and they do that, then they will stay out of it. I won't say they stay out of an area. I think here on the coast, it's so thick that they can run around and kind of get safe so quickly that they're more apt to come back or hang in an area because they know they're safe there. And people just don't go in the brush and keep chasing them around because it's impossible to do. But hunting pressure will dictate when they come out. Weather is the second biggest indicator, aside from the rut. Obviously, the rut will affect when deer move. That will move to #1 when the rut kicks in. But I put time of year because there's, I think during the winter and like late season is tough hunting during the day because the day's so short and the nights are longer and they like feeding at night anyway. So I just think the deer are on their feet during the day less. Weather, we all know rain, it seems to help blacktail hunting. They love that nasty weather. Wind can help it. In fact, everybody's got their own opinions on that. I don't know that there's hard, fast rules there, but temperature, changes in temperature. The whitetail world has found that, that's probably one of the biggest things is a change in temperature. If you have really long, consistent hot days, the first really cold day in and around that, the deer movement might be a little better. But you know, deer movement's random. I've noticed here there's times when the deer are moving really good in the middle of the day, or maybe like in the morning they were out later and then they bedded later. And then now they didn't get up till later, until after dark because they went to bed later. So it definitely fluctuates and there's no hard, fast rules. And the moon, I've listened to lots of theories and information on that and scientific studies on it. And as much as we'd like to think, they have not been able to find any real conclusive evidence on it from what I've seen. So my theory is on the moon is that I think that full moon days, the midday movement is better because it's more light out at night. They're going to probably spend a little more time out at night, even though they like to be there anyway. And the days when it's a dark moon, you might have better day movement in the morning, first thing in the morning and last thing at night. That's my own opinion on it. Again, it's just an opinion. All right, these are my key takeaways. So if you're asleep right now because I talked and bored you to death, now's the time to wake up. These are things that I just think have been important to me anyway. And number one, and traditional archery has really opened my eyes to this, is being observant to your surroundings. There's so much sign that these animals leave behind that I've walked past for years. I mean, of course I saw rubs. You know, I would see trails, I would see the obvious, but I wouldn't really let it sink in and try to figure out more what's going on. And you really need to read what's going on and you will become more aware of what's taking place when you aren't there. Because most of the things that we use to our advantage to hunt these deer is signs that they've left behind, you know, at night or when we're not there. And so you've got to get good at reading that sign and being observant. And the more observant you are, the better you're going to do. And it takes time of looking at these things and trying to figure it out. Maybe going with somebody that knows what to look for can help you speed up that process. But that's key. Bedding is key to daytime action. That's huge for me. Patience is 100% mandatory. I'm not telling you guys anything new there with blacktail deer. And confidence. This is the thing. So you got to have patience and you got to have confidence. Without confidence, you're not going to have patience. I'll tell you that right now. And some people need that picture of that buck to have the confidence to go sit. And that does help. And that's honestly, that was me a lot of times when I first started doing this. But the more that you do it and the more you experience success, the more confident you'll be, the more patient you'll be. So you have to believe that the deer is there. And then you will have the patience to wait him out. Whether you're glassing a reprod from a distance with a rifle, if I haven't went over there and like set foot around there and seen the sign in that reprod patch, and I haven't seen the droppings or I haven't seen rubs or I haven't physically seen deer there, it could look so good and I could sit there and glass it, but I'm not going to have the confidence that I really need to sit there and wait for half the day for that buck to show his face. So these scouting things and these observing things is what gives you the confidence to be patient. Hunt the conditions. We talked about that. Check the weather before you go hunting. If you don't do that, start doing it now. Check the wind. Start to pay attention to those things and what it does to the movement in your areas. Scouting is mandatory to find these deer. And so don't just go out hunting and do what everyone else is doing. Yeah, develop critical thinking skills about how and where you hunt. I started hunting because everybody, you know, clear cuts because that's what you do. I've never hunted blacktail at first and, oh, this is what you do. Well, if you're doing what everybody else is doing, yes, you might find success here and there, but I can promise you, if you're wanting to kill mature deer on public land, you're going to have to start doing things that other people aren't doing. And that is my talk. Every once in a while, a guy gets lucky. Jack, you recognize that buck. You helped pack him out. But this is my buddy, Dave. He's been a lifetime blacktail hunter and lives in Astoria. And we went and hunted the late season archery hunt. He had never gotten a deer with a bow before. And this was our third year going down. We hunted stands. He put in many hours trying to get a buck. And we came home empty-handed several years. But this was his first deer with a bow. It was rutting a doe, and it was in a topographical funnel close to some good food sources that I had found. And he said it was like the highlight of his deer hunting life. So I figured that would be a good one to end on.
Yeah, it was a cool day.
All right.
Yeah, well, Matt, thank you so much. I think we'll jump right in. If there's any questions, you guys can type them out in the chat, and we can try and answer those for you. And if you don't have any questions, thanks everyone for joining tonight. So we'll give it a few minutes if you guys got any questions, and we'll go from there.
I'm going to see, can you see the chat?
Yeah. Nothing yet. Just a few people. They said, "Hey, thank you. Well done. Thank you." And then it says, "You talk a lot about stands. Do you use them for bow and rifle hunting?"
That's a great question. So I love archery hunting, and I primarily do that. But if I was hunting with a rifle, this is a great question. And a couple of buddies of mine, a buddy of mine, we've talked about this a lot. And I think if you were rifle hunting and wanted to do something different, I would tree stand hunt in areas and get up in areas to get a vantage where nobody else can see from a road. You know, guys go to landings, they get to areas where they can see well, and they're patient and they kill bucks. Well, if you can do that from a vantage that nobody else has because you climbed up in a tree stand, you are going to have a huge advantage. And if I did rifle hunt more, I would do that. I have been rifle hunting with my son, and I honestly, I haven't done it. But I'll tell you right now, I think one of the reasons I've had good success on mature bucks with a bow is because it forced me to get into the cover where they're at. And that's where they spend most of their time. And if you do that, I think you're not going to have as much consistent deer sightings. Okay. So you might go out. My goal, if I go out 4 times, if I sit 4 times in a stand, I should see a deer at least once. And if I'm doing really good, I'll see a deer 1 every 3 times I'm out. And the thing is, you got to be okay with going out and not seeing anything. But when you see something, if it's a buck, you're going to kill it. It's right there. I mean, it's a great opportunity. So it's kind of feast or famine. You know, people ask, "Oh, how did you do today? How many deer you say?" I'm like, "Oh, I didn't see anything. Oh, I didn't see anything. Oh, I didn't see anything. Oh, boom, I killed a buck." So it's like, it can be a little more challenging from the patient side. But if it were me, I would try to get up in like a thick reprod or some really good deer area that I know the deer are in, and get up where I could see in a stand with a rifle, and where I can shoot, 100 yards this way. I'm on the edge of some timber, and I would just sit there and wait it out using these same principles, but maybe go to a spot where I can utilize that rifle to shoot into some good areas.
Yeah, the recording will be available. We will put it up on our BHA YouTube channel, and me and Joel will get that up probably in the next couple days, if not sooner. From Brett, if you consistently see does in an area through the year, is there a good chance that bucks will be nearby come hunting season?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And if you know an area where does are consistently, and especially if you can find where they're bedding, and I would encourage you to you can do it now. If you know where it's at now and you have a trail camera and you can get in where they're bedding without blowing them out too bad. I mean, but if you can get in there and set up a camera on a spot close to where you think they like to lay down and where they like to spend the day, and there's like a good trail near there, put a camera on it and let it sit. And you don't even have to go in there and hunt. Maybe this year I'm not even going to hunt that way, but at least now I'm getting information on what's taking place there during the rut. And then you'll be surprised. You might be surprised. Oh yeah, there was 3 different bucks that came by there, the last week of October, and they were in that thick cover during the day. Then hey, this is a spot that I need to go try to do that on. And I think that's a good way to examine an area without having to actually sit there for all day and see if they come in. And that's what I've done with a lot of my areas is rely on historical data. I'll find a promising area and I like it. I'll hang a camera up and somewhere in there and I'll let it do my surveillance, and I'll just stay out of there. I'll go hunt my other spots. And then after season, I'll go pull it. And then that's when I'll analyze the information and start to put it together. And if I see some nice bucks in the area, but maybe they only came by like twice, then I know that I need to relocate where are these deer coming. And what I found is what time they come is very important. So if they came like October 25th through the 30th, I seen them there multiple times and then they were gone. Like next year, as long as that doe doesn't get killed off, she will come into estrus around the same time, roughly. And that can vary off diet and other things. So it's not hard and fast. But if things are similar, she'll come into estrus pretty close. And so those bucks will be there about the same time. And that's how I killed my buck last year. I had 3 years of information on him. It was always during rifle season, and I'm a bow hunter. I usually hunt late bow season, but the rut here is during rifle. So I saw that, from October 25th through November 1st, this buck was coming through in the middle of the day multiple times, not every day, but like if I sat there for a week straight and I didn't blow deer out of there, I knew I'd get an opportunity at him. And that's what happened. It was my eighth sit of the season, but it was only like my third or fourth sit in that location when I killed them. And so hopefully that helps.
You mentioned peak rut dates. What would you guess on dates for the Southern Washington Cascades? Thanks for doing this. Great information.
Well, that's a good question. And that is one area I haven't hunted. I know some guys that hunt, that hunt the Toodle and some other areas there. But my guess would be if it's similar to, Southern Oregon, it's going to be a little later. The study and that they did for all blacktail deer, they kind of grouped all of them together, so it wasn't broken up by region. But they said November 10th was their average peak breeding date or peak rut date throughout the state. And so I would say you're probably a week after that. A good time to hunt would be that first week of November into up to Thanksgiving, is that probably would all fall within that pre-rut and peak rut time. Your guys' rifle season is kind of interesting because it ends on the 31st, which I think would be kind of early for there, but bucks should be staging and starting to get ready, but they're probably not like rutting a ton yet, maybe. I don't have a ton of experience there specifically to speak on that, but that would be my thought. And then, I think that probably you have that late buck hunt, and I don't know if you can hunt there on that late buck. It's like 3 days in the middle of November. That would be a good time to be hunting for sure. If you can hunt with a gun, then that would be when I'd really key in on the southern Cascades in Washington, if you can.
Jared asks if you have any tips for the November 20th to December 12th archery season. He's hunting near Corvallis. Yeah, so that's that.
Near Corvallis, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's a tough one. I lived in Monmouth. I hunted that Corvallis area for a while, so I know it pretty well. The bucks there, I would say that first week in November is definitely peak rut there, into the second week in November. So it's tough. I would say the first part of the season would definitely be my favorite. That first week would be my favorite. And after that, it still can be good. I just think the rutting activity is going to be very, just like everywhere, it depends on where you're at. If you're in one area where there's a hot doe, it could be unbelievable. And if the doe was in estrus a week ago, the bucks aren't there, they're somewhere else. So I personally would really try to take, if it were me and I were going to hunt the Corvallis area, what I would do is I would really try to find the spots I talked about, and then I'd run cameras in them, and I would analyze that for a couple of years and see which time was the best. Because that's basically what I did where I'm at, and I found the rifle season's better. So if rifle season's a better time for the rut, deer are on their feet that first week of November, you can hunt up to that Friday. Last year was the latest it would be. It was like November 6th or something, I think. And so if it's a year like that, it might be better to hunt rifle season that year. If the season ends November 1st, then I would probably lean more to hunting the bow season. And using the same tactics is good. Finding where they're bedding, they're still going to be feeding and bedding, and the does are. That's all they're worried about. The bucks are going where the does are. So I still would be trying to key in on doe areas. And you can really geek out and get it broken down to like, okay, I've got all these different, say I've got like 4 or 5 different spots. I know bucks are kind of going after does in all these spots. Well, the last year, this spot, they were here early in the season, and this other spot, they were going more and later. Then I would try to hunt this spot earlier, and then I'd hunt the other spot later based off of the information I gathered. But you don't always have that to go off of. And sometimes you just kind of being out there and reading the sign. If you're seeing the deer are there and you're seeing signs of bucks, and this is a good pinch point, that's a good place to sit. But I would definitely key in on the middle of the day. Do not go home. If anything, I would like let the deer bed in the morning, go sit and close to where they're at, and then sit there all the way till is one of my favorite strategies. But early morning, I've had deer come by too. So it's kind of that time of year. I think you just got to be in the woods as much as you can.
How much do you think such a late start to late season archery this year will affect activity?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it really will. And to be honest, I mean, that's one of the reasons why I like to hunt the Cascades, or, the Cascade deer, they rut later from what I've seen. And I haven't spent a ton of time in the North Cascades. I've hunted the Hood unit. I haven't hunted the, like the Santa Ana ton, in those areas, but I'd be willing to bet that the rut's a little bit later. So for me, if I'm going to do late archery, I'm going to hunt those areas where the rut is later. I'm going to try to key in more on the Cascades. If I'm hunting the valley, I'm hunting the coast, I'm going to focus more on the rifle season dates and really make my money there. But that's my own opinion. I know there's lots of guys that probably disagree with that.
Personally, I've seen a lot. So in the valley itself and closer to the coast, like Halloween's kind of money up here in the Salem area. But I have friends and know people that hunt 30 to 45 minutes east just at the foothills of the Cascades. And a lot of times it's kind of like down south where that Thanksgiving time or the week before, they have a lot of rut activity. And it's only, I mean, you think it's the same country, right? It's only a half hour, 45 minutes. But once you get up into those foothills, it changes quite a bit.
Yeah. Well, and the reason that changes is those deer, I mean, I really think this anyways, those deer a lot of those bucks are migrating, right? Or they're in the snow. A lot of the does are coming out of the high country too, and they're concentrating down lower with other deer that live down low. So I think there will be a little bit of rut early, but the deer that are in the valley don't move very much, and they're stick to their own little areas. So their rut is, I think it's more narrow. It's a little more consistent, where when you have like in Southern Oregon, you have resident deer and migrating deer, and there's so many different variables going on that I think the rut is a wider span of time too. And it is later, but I think it's more spread out because there's those deer are almost like different deer even though they're the same breed, they behave differently. And I think that there's more of them too. So they rut at different times, but
yeah,
definitely if you go farther east, I think the rut's later. Wouldn't you agree?
Yeah, I would say so. Yeah. Let's see. Great info. Thanks for the presentation. Do you mainly stick to General Western, or do you put in for the 100 series?
So I typically, yeah, it's funny because I do have some deer points and I really don't know what I want to do with them. But putting in for 100 series is good. There's some cool late blacktail muzzleloader hunts that are fun. I drew the late Hood hunt. I took like 12 points to get, and it wasn't what I was hoping it would be. I mean, I had a fun hunt. I could hunt with a rifle during the rut, so that was great. But I didn't see the bucks that I was really hoping to see. So I typically will either do I'll either do the late archery or I'll hunt rifle, Western Oregon, any legal weapon.
Elijah says, awesome presentation. Sorry he came in late, but today he was up around 4,000 feet and he started to see snow in some shaded areas. So Elijah, this will be on YouTube if you want to catch the first part of it. And then his question is, how quick do the deer move out once the snow hits?
That's a great question. And so I'm going to rely on, I ran cameras when I lived down in Southern Oregon and hunted the Cascades more. And I thought it wasn't until the snow showed up, and and I was talking with the biologist and asked him this, and this is theoretical, so take it for what it's worth. But I noticed on my cameras, the bucks were showing up that came from the high country. I was getting pictures of them in the middle of October before any snow. And I think that part of that staging process, that some bucks, not all of them, but I think some of them will come down low where there's more doe groups. So up in that national forest ground where we talked about it's 4 deer per square mile, there's not as good a feed. I mean, there's cuts up there maybe where you're at, I don't know. But if it's a lot of timber, those deer, there's not a lot of deer there. Those bucks are going to come down earlier to get, not because of the snow, because they want to get where the does are. So I think it depends on your doe numbers. If you're seeing good doe numbers up high where you're at, then the bucks will probably be there, and they won't come down until the does come down with the snow. And so you have to kind of keep tabs on that. But that would be my thought process. If there's not a lot of does, I'm not seeing a lot of deer, I would move down lower and try to find where there's better concentration of deer. And I definitely have noticed that at times. It's fun hunting up in the snow though. If you get a buck track, I mean, walking that until you find him is a deadly tactic. So I always kind of go back and forth. If there's snow and I can hunt in it, I love doing that. But I know that I'm not going to see as many deer typically.
And I know a few people I've talked to, they really enjoy hunting that snow line. And one of it is catching tracks and tracking them. But they've also noticed that those deer during the rut kind of hover right in within a couple 100 feet of that snow line.
Absolutely.
And that's been
lots of, I would agree with that 100%. I grew up, in Southern Oregon, and I know lots of good buck hunters, and they're guys that absolutely key in on that snow line. And it's true. There can be an elevation or a concentration of deer at that elevation that when you find where they're at, and they can still be in, 6-8 inches of snow, a foot of snow. I've seen them still there. Typically they're in that, that if they are at that snow line, they're either, anywhere just below it into 6 to 10 inches, I would say are the most common areas where I've seen them hanging. But sometimes some of those bucks and those does will hang up there till the bitter
end. Yeah, well, it looks like it's it for questions. We appreciate it, gents. Lots of great takeaways. And then Matt Scott says, thank you for sharing some of your hard-earned tips. Really appreciate it. So, yeah.
Well, you're welcome, you guys. Hopefully it helps you out. It's definitely fun to go out there and try to learn some stuff. And I don't know, hopefully if it helps any of you guys, or if you just take a couple of things away from it, then it'll definitely be worthwhile. And hopefully, I guess if nothing else, if you guys really try to be a good steward out there and be a good representation for us as hunters, that's the main thing I would ask. And we run into all sorts of different things out there with people that are hunting, and we definitely need guys that are showing, doing things the right way. So I just ask that you do that and be willing to share information when you learn stuff too, because I've learned more from other people than I have from my own observations and trying to go out. I've definitely learned way more from other people. So
awesome. Well, hey, thank you everybody for joining tonight. Matt, thank you for your time. I know that it's valuable. And we probably owe your wife a goodie basket for sharing that time tonight away from the family. But yeah, that was awesome. Lots of great info. And yeah, this will be up on our YouTube, hopefully in the next couple of days. So you'll be able to go back through these PowerPoint slides and check some of this stuff out if you missed something. Again, thanks for coming to our Pint Night tonight. And Chris will be hosting one in the next couple of weeks, I believe. So if you guys ever trying to get a hold of us, we have a Facebook group, and we've also got an Instagram page. That's just Oregon BHA. So you can always get a hold of us there if you got any questions or concerns. So thanks so much, everybody, and good luck with the rest of your hunting season. And hopefully this will help you guys fill those tags.
Thanks, Jack.
Yeah, thank you. All right. Night, everybody.